My wife served me with divorce papers, disappeared without a trace, and a few months later Jason and Madison had built a life that, on the surface, seemed ideal. They had been together for 4 years and married for 1. Their relationship was smooth, stable, and filled with the kind of understanding that comes from years of companionship. Madison had always been warm, affectionate, and seemingly content. They shared everything, or at least Jason thought they did. Then, the changes started. At first, they were subtle. Madison, who had never shown much interest in finances, suddenly developed an intense curiosity about their money. It began with casual questions, little things like, "How much do we have in savings?" Or, "What exactly is in your investment portfolio?" Jason, who worked in finance, was used to managing their account. In the past, Madison had always been indifferent about it, trusting him to handle their wealth. But now, she wanted details. And not just general figures, she wanted specifics. "How much exactly did you inherit from your grandfather again?" she asked one evening over dinner, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. Jason looked up from his plate. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged, stirring her food absent-mindedly. "I was just thinking, about the future. About security." The answer made sense, on the surface. It was reasonable for a spouse to want to understand their financial situation. And yet, something about the way she asked, about the suddenness of her interest, unsettled him. At first, he told himself he was being paranoid. He loved Madison, and she loved him. There was no reason for him to be suspicious. But the questions kept coming. She started bringing up investments more often, asking about the stock market, something she had never cared about before. "What's the best way to move money around?" she asked one day, feigning casual interest. Like, if someone wanted to, say, move large amounts between accounts without drawing too much attention? Jason forced a smile. "Are you planning to start trading?" She laughed, but the sound was hollow. No, just curious." Curious. That was her answer every time. Then there were the phone calls. Madison had always been a social person, but lately she had been stepping away to take calls in hushed tones. At first, he assumed they were work-related, until he realized they often happened late at night, long after work hours. Sometimes, when he entered the room, she would abruptly end the conversation or lower her voice. One evening, Jason walked into their bedroom earlier than expected. Madison was on the phone, her back turned toward him. "No, that's too soon," she was saying. "We need more time." Jason froze. His heart pounded. More time for what? Madison must have sensed him there because she spun around quickly, her expression unreadable. "Hey babe," she said, forcing a smile as she ended the call. "Work stuff." Jason nodded but said nothing. He wasn't sure if it was the flicker of panic in her eyes or the way she had rushed to hide the screen of her phone, but his stomach twisted. He started noticing other things. She had become strangely obsessed with checking their bank accounts. More than once, he caught her staring at their joint account statements, her face unreadable. One night, he pretended to be asleep as she sat beside him in bed, scrolling through their financial history on her phone. He watched through half-lidded eyes as she navigated between accounts, pausing on certain transactions. The unease in his gut grew. Madison also started working late. It wasn't unusual for her to put in extra hours occasionally, but now it was happening frequently. The explanations were always vague. "Big project," she'd say. "What kind of project?" he asked once, keeping his tone light. She hesitated. "Just, client stuff." She wasn't lying, not exactly. But something was off. Jason's profession had taught him to recognize patterns, to see warning signs where others might miss them. And the signs were piling up. The sudden interest in money. The secretive calls. The frequent absences. The vague answers. Instinct told him to act. So he did what he knew best. He began securing his asset. Quietly, methodically, he started protecting himself. He reviewed his investment accounts, ensuring that Madison couldn't access the ones that weren't explicitly shared. He moved a portion of his liquid assets into a separate account in his name alone. He even contacted his lawyer, subtly inquiring about what protections were in place should there ever be an issue. He told himself he wasn't overreacting. And yet, he couldn't shake the growing suspicion that something was very, very wrong. One evening, Madison left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. Jason hesitated before stepping closer. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't the type to invade privacy, but hadn't she already been invading his? The screen showed an open tab, a secure banking portal. She had been looking at transfer limits. Jason felt something cold settle in his stomach. He didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, he watched. The tension between them was growing, even though they never spoke about it directly. Jason noticed the way Madison's eyes flicked to him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way she hesitated before answering certain questions. The way she clutched her phone just a little tighter, as if afraid he might see something he wasn't supposed to. One night, while she was in the shower, Jason did something he never thought he would do. He checked her phone. The call logs were full of unknown numbers. Numbers she had called multiple times in the past few weeks. One number stood out, a frequent caller. Jason copied it down. He took a breath and dialed it from his own phone, heart pounding. A man answered. Jason didn't speak. There was a long pause before the man said, "Madison?" Jason ended the call. His hands shook. The humiliation of it all settled over him like a suffocating weight. His wife, the woman he trusted, was hiding something, and it had everything to do with their money. With him. But Jason was prepared. Because while Madison thought she was making careful moves in the shadows, she had no idea that Jason had already started playing his own game. And soon, she would realize, he was always one step ahead. Jason sat at the kitchen table, sipping his morning coffee, when Madison walked in, her expression unreadable. She moved with an eerie calmness, placing a stack of papers in front of him without a single word. Jason's eyes flicked down. Divorce papers. His hands tightened around the mug, but he said nothing. Instead, he simply looked up at her, studying her face. There was no anger, no sadness, just a cold detachment that felt rehearsed. "I think this is for the best," she said, her voice eerily level. Jason exhaled slowly, setting his mug down. "Why now?" His tone was controlled, measured. Madison hesitated, as if she hadn't expected him to ask. Then she straightened, folding her arms. "We've grown apart. I've changed. You've changed." She sounded like she was reading from a script, as if she had practiced these words over and over. Jason didn't react. He had expected this. Everything had been leading to this moment, the financial obsession, the secretive phone calls, the distant glances. He had spent weeks preparing for whatever she had planned, protecting his assets, consulting his lawyer. The only thing left was to hear the lie she had chosen to tell. "Is that it?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Madison's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't want to argue," she said, carefully avoiding his gaze. "I just think it's best if we go our separate ways. No tears. No regret. No anger. Just a clean, surgical cut." Jason glanced at the papers, flipping through them slowly. "You've already filled everything out," he noted. She nodded. "It'll be easier if we do this quickly." Easier for her, he thought. Madison stood there, expecting a fight. Maybe she had been bracing for anger, demands, accusations. But Jason simply set the papers down and said, "Okay." A flicker of something passed over her face, shock, confusion. "That's it?" she asked, her voice breaking just slightly. Jason leaned back in his chair. "You want a divorce. You've clearly been thinking about it for a while. I won't stop you." Madison's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She had expected resistance. She had prepared for a battle. But Jason wasn't giving her one. "You can sign them whenever you're ready," she murmured. Then she turned and walked out, leaving Jason alone at the table. The second she was gone, Jason exhaled, allowing himself a moment to process. He didn't feel sad. He didn't feel betrayed. He felt confirmation. Everything he had suspected was true. Madison had been planning this, working behind his back, making sure she was in the best possible position to leave him. But she had underestimated him. He pulled out his phone and called his lawyer. "It's happening," Jason said, his voice steady. "I figured as much," his lawyer replied. "Good thing we got ahead of this." Jason moved through the steps effortlessly. The accounts had already been secured, his assets protected. Madison had no access to anything beyond what was legally required. Every financial move she had made in recent months, he had countered quietly, without her ever realizing. The next few days passed in a strange silence. Madison acted as if nothing had happened. She still lived in the house, still moved through their shared spaces as if she hadn't just dropped a bomb on their marriage. Jason observed her closely. She was waiting for something, for him to break, to plead, to lash out. But Jason gave her nothing. She was the one who had betrayed their marriage, who had been making plans in the shadows. And yet, with every passing day, she seemed more uneasy, more restless. Finally, she broke. "Why aren't you angry?" she demanded one night, standing in the doorway of the living room, arms crossed tightly. Jason looked up from his laptop. "What good would that do?" Madison blinked, thrown off balance. "You're just okay with this? You made your choice," he said simply. "I've accepted it." She clenched her jaw. "You don't even want to talk about it?" "What is there to talk about?" he asked. "You decided this on your own. You handed me the papers without a conversation. So what exactly do you want me to say? Madison opened her mouth, then closed it. She hadn't expected this. She had prepared for a man who would crumble, who would beg her to stay, who would try to fix things. Instead, Jason was treating it like a business transaction, just as she had intended. Except it didn't feel good. The power she thought she had? It was slipping. In the days that followed, the humiliation started creeping in. Jason wasn't devastated. He wasn't wallowing. He wasn't even remotely interested in why she was doing this. He simply handled everything with quiet efficiency. And Madison? She was unraveling. Jason saw it in the way she hesitated before speaking to him, the way she hovered outside the room before walking in, as if debating whether to say something. He caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, her expression tight. She was waiting for regret, for pain. But Jason felt neither. When they finally met with their lawyers, the process was shockingly smooth. Madison sat stiffly in her chair, arms crossed, while Jason remained calm. Every document, every financial matter, every negotiation, he had already prepared for it all. The settlement was fair, but Madison quickly realized something. She wasn't walking away with as much as she had hoped. Her jaw tightened as she glanced at the papers. This isn't. It's exactly what we agreed to, Jason interrupted smoothly. She looked at him then, really looked at him. There was no emotion on his face, no lingering love, no bitterness. Just quiet finality. And that's when it hit her. She had already lost. Not just the marriage, but the control. Jason had been ahead of her from the start. Every move she made, he had anticipated. Every financial advantage she thought she had secured had already been neutralized. She wasn't leaving with power. She was leaving with nothing more than what was legally owed to her. Madison signed the papers with a tight grip on the pen. She didn't look at Jason as she handed them back. And just like that, it was done. A few days later, she packed her things. Jason stood by the doorway as she loaded the last of her bags into her car. For a moment, she hesitated. She turned to look at him, searching for something, maybe a sign that this still mattered. But Jason's expression was unreadable. She forced a smile. Well, take care. Jason nodded. You too. She lingered for a second longer, but when he didn't say anything else, she got into her car and drove away. Jason watched until the taillights disappeared down the street. Then he closed the door and locked it. Madison had spent months thinking she was in control. She had orchestrated this entire exit, planned for every outcome. Except this one. Because in the end, Jason hadn't fought her. He had simply let her go. And that was the deepest humiliation of all. Character. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Madison disappeared. It started with small things, missed calls, unanswered texts. Jason wasn't paying attention at first. The divorce had come and gone with no drama on his part, and he had already moved on, focused on stabilizing his life. But then, the messages from others began. First, her friends. Hey Jason, have you talked to Maddie? Is Madison okay? She's not answering anyone. I'm starting to get worried. It's not like her to just disappear. Jason read each message and felt nothing. He had no idea where she was, and more importantly, he didn't care. Then her job called. It was her former boss, someone Jason had only met once at a company dinner. I know this is strange, the man said, sounding uneasy. But Madison quit without notice. She just sent an email and disappeared. No response, no explanation. She didn't even pick up her final paycheck. Jason frowned slightly. That was odd. Madison had spent years building her career. She wasn't the type to walk away from a steady job without a backup plan. Then again, he reminded himself, she wasn't his problem anymore. I don't know where she is, he said simply. Her boss hesitated, as if waiting for Jason to offer more, but when the silence stretched, he just sighed. Well, if you hear from her, tell her we're concerned. Jason didn't respond. He just ended the call. More messages came. More people asking, searching. And then, silence. Eventually, they all stopped trying. People moved on, assuming Madison had done what she always did, made her own decisions without explanation, leaving behind whoever she no longer needed. Jason, however, knew better. This wasn't like Madison. She was always calculating, always making sure she had something to fall back on. The way she had obsessed over finances, asked about transferring money, secured her exit, it had all been carefully planned. And yet, in the end, she had walked away with almost nothing. The realization settled over Jason like a quiet revelation. She had lost. Whatever plan she had been building, whatever scheme she had been crafting, it had failed. She had expected a fight. She had expected power. She had expected to leave the marriage with an advantage. Instead, she had been outmaneuvered, left with nothing more than a standard divorce settlement. And now? She was gone. Jason went about his life, rebuilding. He refocused on work, reconnecting with old friends, stepping back into the rhythm of a life that had once been weighed down by the tension of his marriage. Weeks passed. Then months. Madison remained a ghost. Occasionally, her name would come up in passing, someone mentioning her at a dinner, a colleague asking if he had heard anything new. But Jason never had an answer. And deep down, he realized something. Madison hadn't just disappeared from her job, her friends, or her family. She had disappeared from herself. She had spent years crafting an identity, one built on control, power, and careful manipulation. And when that identity crumbled, when the future she had counted on slipped through her fingers, she had nothing left. Jason hadn't just let her go. He had taken away the one thing she had never prepared for: the quiet, crushing weight of irrelevance. 5 months after the divorce, Jason was thriving. The suffocating weight of his failed marriage had lifted, and in its place, a new sense of freedom took root. He had thrown himself into work, earning a well-deserved promotion. He had started exercising, taking control of his health the way he had taken control of his life. He even started dating again. Lauren, a pediatric nurse with a warm smile and an easy laugh. Lauren was everything Madison wasn't. Where Madison had been cold and calculating, Lauren was genuine and kind. Where Madison had been obsessed with status, Lauren found joy in the simplest things: a good meal, a lazy Sunday, a heartfelt conversation. Jason felt lighter with her. For the first time in years, he wasn't second-guessing every interaction. He wasn't analyzing every word, searching for hidden motives. He could just be. And then, one night, Madison returned. It was nearly midnight when the pounding on his front door started. Jason, half asleep, frowned as he sat up in bed. Beside him, Lauren stirred, blinking in confusion. "Who the hell is that?" she murmured. Jason had a sinking feeling in his gut as he got up. He didn't need to guess. When he opened the door, Madison stood on the porch. She looked awful. Her once perfect hair was unkempt, her expensive clothes now wrinkled and hanging loosely on her frame. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, her skin paler than he remembered. She wasn't wearing makeup, and for the first time in their entire relationship, she looked real. Not the polished, put-together woman she had always presented herself as. Not the woman who had once planned her every move with precision. Just tired. Just desperate. Jason didn't say anything. He just stared at her, waiting. Madison let out a shaky breath. "Aren't you going to say something?" Jason leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I wasn't expecting company." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, I wasn't expecting to be here either." Silence stretched between them. Jason didn't invite her in. She shifted on her feet, arms wrapping around herself as if she were trying to hold herself together. "Can we talk?" she asked, voice quieter now. Jason exhaled slowly. "About what?" Madison's jaw tightened. Then, her eyes flicked past him, into the house. Jason knew the exact moment she saw Lauren. Lauren, who had quietly walked into the hallway, wearing one of Jason's shirts, her face filled with sleepy confusion. Madison went still. Her entire body tensed. And then, something inside her snapped. "You moved on this fast?" Her voice was sharp, dripping with disbelief and anger. Jason didn't flinch. He just met her gaze, unmoved. "It's been 5 months, Madison." Her face twisted in something close to disgust. 5 months, Jason. 5 months. That's all it took for you to replace me. Jason tilted his head, studying her. "You left." Madison's hands curled into fists. "And you just moved on?" Jason's patience thinned. "What did you think was going to happen?" She stared at him, breathing heavily, eyes flashing with something raw and ugly. "Wow," she muttered, shaking her head. "So that's it? I come back, and you just, what? Act like none of it mattered." Jason let out a short, humorless laugh. "You didn't come back, Madison. You showed up at my door in the middle of the night, unannounced, after disappearing for 5 months. And instead of explaining where you've been, you're mad at me." Madison's face flushed. She opened her mouth, then shut it. For the first time, Jason saw something crack in her expression. She hadn't expected this. She had expected control, power. She had expected to walk in, to say the right words, and to see him hesitate, to see regret in his eyes, to feel like she still mattered. Instead, she was standing on his porch like a stranger. And the worst part? He wasn't even angry. He wasn't heartbroken. He wasn't conflicted. He was indifferent. And that was the deepest humiliation of all. Madison swallowed, looking away. For a moment, Jason thought she might say something real. Something honest. Instead, she scoffed, turning on her heel. "Forget it," she muttered, voice thick with resentment. "You always were good at pretending things didn't matter." Jason didn't stop her. He just watched as she walked away, disappearing into the night. Lauren stepped beside him, her hand brushing his arm. That was intense. Jason let out a breath. Yeah, he said. Then, without another glance at the empty street, he shut the door. Madison didn't stay away. 3 days after showing up at Jason's doorstep in the middle of the night, she was back, this time in broad daylight. Jason had just returned from a morning run when he saw her car parked outside. She was leaning against it, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. He wasn't surprised. With a sigh, he walked up to her. "What do you want, Madison?" She pushed off the car, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We need to talk." Jason wiped the sweat from his forehead, glancing at his watch. "I don't think we do." Her eyes flashed with irritation. "Jason, please." Something in her voice was different this time. Less anger. More desperation. Jason studied her for a moment before nodding toward the porch. "Fine. 5 minutes." Madison walked up the steps ahead of him, hesitating at the door. She glanced inside as if expecting to see Lauren there. Jason didn't say a word, just stepped past her and held the door open. Once inside, she fidgeted. Her hands twisted together, her shoulders drawn tight. Jason crossed his arms. "Get to the point." Madison exhaled sharply, as if trying to steady herself. Then she lifted her chin and spoke. "I need money." Jason almost laughed. "Of course." He leaned against the wall, arms still crossed. "Not happening." She scowled. "You didn't even let me explain." "You don't have to," he said flatly. "I know how this works. You show up, you spin a story, and you expect me to care. But I don't, Madison. Not anymore." Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. For a second, it looked like she might lash out. But then, something shifted in her expression, something that almost resembled shame. She sighed, rubbing her temple. "Fine. You want the truth." Jason waited. Madison let out a humorless laugh. "I left because of someone else." Jason didn't blink. He had already assumed as much. "I reconnected with an old boyfriend," she continued. "From high school. We started talking a few months before the divorce." Jason felt nothing. No anger, no jealousy, not even disappointment. Just mild curiosity about how pathetic this was about to get. Madison's eyes darted to him, searching for a reaction. When she didn't get one, she kept going. "We made plans. He told me we could start over together. He had this dream, getting out of the city, buying land, living simply." She swallowed. "So when we split, I took my share of the settlement and went with him. We bought a farm." Jason stared at her. Then, finally, he let out a breath of amusement. "A farm." She flinched at the way he said it. Jason shook his head. "You, who once refused to step in a park because it had too much dirt, bought a farm?" Madison's face flushed. "It was supposed to be different. We had plans. We were going to raise animals, grow our own food, make a life." Jason tilted his head, watching her unravel. "And..." Her jaw clenched. "And it was a disaster." "Of course it was." She looked away, her hands tightening at her sides. "Neither of us knew what we were doing. The money ran out faster than we thought. Repairs, equipment, costs we didn't expect, everything kept piling up. We burned through the settlement in months." Jason nodded slowly. "And let me guess, he didn't have any money either." Madison's silence was answer enough. Jason let out a low chuckle. "So you left a stable life, a good marriage, and financial security to play pretend on a farm with a guy who couldn't even afford to keep the lights on?" Madison's face twisted. "I thought it would work." Jason just shook his head. She took a breath, steadying herself. "That's not all." She hesitated, her fingers clenching into fists before she finally forced the words out. "I'm pregnant." For the first time, Jason actually felt something. Relief. Not heartbreak. Not anger. Just relief. Madison was no longer his problem. She must have seen the lack of emotion on his face, because something in her expression cracked. "You don't even care?" she whispered. Jason's voice was quiet, but firm. "No, Madison. I don't." Her face contorted, her shoulders shaking slightly. "Jason, I have nothing," she said, voice raw. "No money, no job. And now a baby on the way." She swallowed hard. "I don't know what to do." Jason sighed, rubbing his temple. "Let me get this straight. You left me for another man, used the money you got in the divorce to run off and play house, let it all go up in flames, and now you're here. Because when everything fell apart, I was the only one left." Madison looked away. Jason shook his head. "Why would I help you?" Madison flinched. "Because we were married. Because we..." "No," Jason cut her off. "You made a choice. You destroyed your own life. I owe you nothing." Madison's breathing was uneven. She stepped forward. Jason, please. He didn't move. You should go. Her lips trembled. Can we at least talk? Maybe. Madison. His voice was firm. I have moved on. She stared at him, eyes shining with something dangerously close to tears. Just like that. Jason gave her a long look. Then he said the words that finally broke her. You stopped mattering a long time ago. Madison's entire body locked up. For a moment, Jason thought she might scream, might lash out in rage. But she didn't. She just stood there, her entire world crumbling in real time. She had come expecting pity. Expecting a second chance. Expecting, at the very least, that Jason would still care. But he didn't. Not anymore. And nothing was more humiliating than that. With shaking hands, Madison turned and walked toward the door. She paused for a brief second, as if waiting for Jason to stop her. He didn't. She walked out. Jason shut the door behind her without another word. Jason had expected Madison to leave him alone after their last conversation. He had made himself clear. There was nothing left between them, no sympathy, no lingering attachment. She had burned every bridge, and whatever mess she was in now was entirely of her own making. But Madison had never been the type to accept consequences. 3 days later, she was back. This time, there was no pretense, no attempt at manipulation or self-pity. This time, she was furious. Jason had just finished a late shift at work and was looking forward to a quiet evening with Lauren. He had barely stepped out of his car when he heard it, pounding on his front door, a sharp, relentless rhythm. Then her voice. Jason! Open the damn door! Jason sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. She was screaming now, her voice shrill with rage. I know you're in there. Stop pretending like I don't exist. The neighbors were going to love this. Jason locked his car and walked toward the house, taking his time. Madison's tantrum continued, kicking the door, hurling insults, demanding that he be a man and take responsibility. It was pathetic. By the time he reached the porch, she had turned around, ready to pound on the door again. When she saw him, her eyes flashed with something almost triumphant, like she had won a battle just by forcing him to face her. Jason wasn't in the mood. What do you want, Madison? He asked, voice flat. She marched toward him, her hands clenched into fists. I need money, Jason. Jason's patience was already thin. Not my problem. Her face twisted in rage. Yes, it is. You have a good job, a nice house, a perfect little life. She sneered the words like they disgusted her. You can afford to help me. Jason stared at her for a long moment. You don't get to demand anything from me. Madison let out a bitter laugh. Oh, so that's it? You're just going to let me suffer. Jason exhaled slowly, his grip tightening at his sides. You're already suffering, Madison. And not because of me. She went still. Jason's voice was steady, measured, but there was steel beneath the words. I didn't leave you. You left me. You threw away your life because you thought you could do better. He took a slow step forward, forcing her to meet his gaze. And now? You are the one standing here, begging. Madison's throat bobbed, but she quickly masked it with another wave of anger. I made a mistake. Jason cut her off with a cold laugh. No, Madison. You made a choice. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Jason shook his head. And now you expect me to fix it? To bail you out? His eyes hardened. That's never going to happen. Her face crumpled with frustration. You're such a bastard. Jason shrugged. Probably. But I'm not your bastard anymore. Madison's entire body trembled with rage. I don't deserve this, she hissed. I don't deserve to be treated like a consequence? Jason finished for her. Her breath hitched. For the first time, Jason saw it, the real fear beneath the anger. The dawning realization that no one was coming to save her. That she had destroyed everything good in her life and had no way of fixing it. Jason glanced at his phone. You need to leave. She crossed her arms, lifting her chin defiantly. No. Jason nodded and pulled out his phone. Then I'm calling the police. Madison's entire body jerked, as if he had physically struck her. You wouldn't, she spat. Jason raised an eyebrow and put the phone to his ear. Want to find out? For a split second, she just stared at him, stunned. Then, panic flashed across her face. Her pride and desperation warred against each other. Jason could see the moment she realized she had no power here, no leverage, no control. With a sharp, frustrated scream, she turned on her heel and stormed off. She practically ran to her car, yanking the door open with shaking hands. Jason didn't watch her drive away. He didn't care. Instead, he walked back inside and locked the door, shutting out whatever mess Madison had become. Lauren was curled up on the couch, waiting for him. She looked up as he entered, her brow furrowed. Was that her? Jason sighed, shaking his head. Yeah. Lauren studied him for a moment. You okay? Jason sat down beside her, leaning back against the cushions. Then, for the first time since Madison had reappeared in his life, he felt at peace. She's not my problem anymore, he said simply. Lauren smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. No. She's not. Jason exhaled, feeling something settle deep in his chest. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to prove anything. The best revenge was already happening. He was happy. And Madison? She had nothing.